Whew, man, this is good, right? So from what you guys just said, I want to jump ahead, actually. I had this for later, but I really want to ask this question. As a woman of color, but also women of fair-skinned POC women, that's how I consider myself. And also I have deep appreciation for other cultures, and I always wonder the line of appreciation versus appropriation. I always, anybody who knows me knows that I have this collection of African prints because I just love them and I find them beautiful. But then at what point is this appropriation? And at what point is this appreciation, right? And I think what you are saying is really resonating with me, that when you go to the conference and the knowledge that are taught to the masses comes from non-indigenous people, but the knowledge that's passed on are the indigenous knowledge. So I know you practice grandmother medicine. I know you practice grandmother medicine. And how do we spread this knowledge that is important for people to know, and at the same time keeping this integral? I know there's no one answer to that. I know it's a big question, but I want to pick your brain. Yes.
Yeah, this is such an important question, and something that has came up in like the very beginnings of woke foods. When I first started woke foods, I made it very broad. I was like, oh, I'm gonna have this food business and we're gonna make Latin American and Caribbean cuisine. And of course there's so many foods and plants and herbs that are part of Latin America and the Caribbean. And that while the Caribbean has a lot of foods that are of the African diaspora, Spanish-speaking Caribbean food is very different from like other Caribbean foods. And the worker owners, together we decided, you know what, why don't we focus on Dominican food, because that is where our people are from, that is what we know, and we find it important to not be co-opting other folks' foods and cultures. And while we may love Jamaican food, or we may love Colombian food, those are not our people. And in the future, we can bring more worker owners that are from those countries and those cultures, and they can integrate their food practices into our menu. But for right now, all worker owners of woke foods are Dominican. Let's focus on what we know. And it was also a great way to bring in my grandmother's knowledge and recipes. So a lot of the recipes that I know come from my grandmother and from both my grandmothers. And whenever they cook, whenever I talk about in any of these panels, I always bring her up because it's important to give acknowledgement and to give credit where it's due. I always invite her to these things, but she's like, no. Maybe one day she'll come.
Here in spirit.
Yeah, she's here in spirit. And so I think giving acknowledgement, giving credit where it's due, and just making space, asking, so there's an option there, and if the answer is no, then saying, well, I would like to bring you into the space by just mentioning your name and uplifting that everything I know and do is because of you. I think also because of the line of work I do as a chef, we're always getting inspiration from other chefs and from their cultures and recipes. So whenever I make any sort of recipe, I always give credit to where I learned it from. Like I wrote an ebook of recipes recently, and it was a lot of work, and I started getting recipes from other chefs, and I gave credit to all those chefs and said, this recipe is this, or this recipe, I modified it from this. So I just always giving credit, acknowledging, uplifting, and making space so that you're not, so that it's a complex line, it is. But there are things you can do, and so to sort of be like, oh, there's nothing really to do, that's bullshit.
Right. Karen.
appreciation versus appropriation. Oh, I forgot I have this one too. I think, you know, that comes up a lot in medicine, right? So to appreciate medicine would be, let me find out about native plants, Native American plants, and then learn as much as possible as I can about the different system of healing, which we do teach. Appropriation is to then take that information and to make it your own, and then to start to practice without giving any credit of where it's come from. And that's consistently what I see practiced within herbalism, is this sense of like, that was my practice because I paid to learn it, and I'm like, really? Not. And so it's a very colonized approach to indigenous knowledge, right? It's so like, so you paid to attend this class, and therefore the knowledge is yours, and now it's integrated into your practice. I don't understand that. And I think that's where it comes up for me, where I see most appropriation of knowledge is within the culture in herbal medicine. It's huge in our group of apprentices. We have values. We have a core system of values that we realized after having, now we have about 200 apprentices, and so at some point we needed to develop values as a community. And one of those values is that we do not appropriate other people's cultures in our medicine and in our learning. Like, we make it really clear as part of the group, and I think it's necessary as healers to consistently remind people that we can study we can study Chinese medicine, we can study many different things, but where do we draw the line, and how do we give credit? I also find a lot of people will be like, I learned from this person, but you never say the person's name. It's really damaging in that way. And so I see a lot of healers quoting maybe an indigenous healer. I was just reading the other day of someone saying, this medicine man in Jamaica taught me. And I'm like, you have an entire book written about this medicine man, but nowhere in there is his name. It's kind of like, without integrity. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. This was something that I really wanted to ask, so I'm really happy I got to ask this question. So from here, you know, one of the things that I really see happening is that appropriation. And, you know, it's not just in healing world, it's everywhere. And I think of this quite often, and how this is so closely related to this system of patriarchy. We all know here that this country's wealth was built upon thievery and slavery. And when we have that baseline, then, you know, appropriation is just an easy step. It's not so much about, there's no consideration there because the base of this society is built upon the thievery and slavery, so appropriating something is nothing, really, if you think about it. So when I think of, you know, healing or social justice movement, I often think about how are we integrated ourselves into this patriarchal system, and what do we do day to day that's patriarchal, even though we don't really think of it that way. You know, a lot of the things that we talk about in implicit bias, we don't know because we are culturally socialized to be that way, and everything else around us is that way. Then if we start to look into those things, then how are we creating this movement? Is any of the movement building we are currently doing based on the patriarchal system? So oftentimes, I think of process versus goal. Intellectually based knowledge versus innate knowing. And a lot of the things that's about grandmother medicine or ancestral knowledge, those are innate knowing that we tend to discount over intellectual knowledge, what we learn from the books. So if you read it in the book that I learned it from this Jamaican medicine man, then you take that over. Are we the one to take that over actually learning from this Jamaican medicine man? That he actually have this understanding, this innate knowing, this embodied knowing, because he lived that way, right? So I want to transfer these thoughts to this movement building, Because are we at some point when we do this activism work overly prizing, is that the right way to say it? I'm English as a second language person, so I'm sorry. Are we making this intellectual idea to be more valuable than what we know in a gut, right? So I know this is kind of a weird question that I'm asking, but I want you to answer. I'm not letting you off the hook.
No, so I think as much as patriarchy has to do with the healing, there also comes classism that ties into this notion of patriarchy within all the work that we do. And so, like, for me personally, and, you know, the folks that I'm around and the work that I do, we collectively understand this. And I think that we need to develop more, like, I had it written in my notes, and more credible messengers that are folks that are being developed from within our communities that we are empowering to do this kind of work to dismantle the system and which oppresses us. And so, like, for example, like if you're working with someone who does medicine making, it's really important to feel ties and connection, but also know that if this is part of who you are innately, then that it's okay to practice and learn from people, but to appropriate and take and then call it your own is a much different story. And this happens a lot. And a lot of folks that, especially that are coming from low, you know, working class, low income neighborhoods, you know, a lot of the stuff that you see nowadays came from a lot of folks that, you know, work within these neighborhoods. And they just don't get credit where credit is due for the fact that because they don't have the opportunities that many other people have because of working, you know, for someone in the private sector and them not being acknowledged for the work that they do, and then, but they're part of the process of creating things and developing them. So I think that if we understand that if we can build from within, then I think then we can start breaking down a lot of these notions around patriarchy and stuff.
You want to go first?
You know, within this work, most of my work is spent educating women, women from the Caribbean, and all across Latin and South America also, and Africa. But I think one of the things that always come up is what's the value of your medicinal knowledge? So where did you graduate from with that knowledge before it's even given credence, right? So it's like, in the Caribbean, most of us learned medicine from our grandmothers. But when you arrive here, if you haven't graduated from a botanical medicine school, many people are like, well, I'm not so sure about the medicine that you practice, right? And another way that I see this often occur is within our neighborhoods, right? So growing up in Brooklyn, we had so many botanicas. We don't have as many botanicas because that knowledge is no longer valuable. It's become your indigenous knowledge, which is often the first line for an immigrant coming to this country, is to be in a space that is open to the belief that maybe there is a reason that you're not finding a job that's spiritual beyond you just not finding a job, or maybe there's a reason that your child is sick over and over again that's spiritual beyond the child just being physically sick. There's no understanding of that anymore when we removed like that innate indigenous knowledge that I think is so valuable. So for me, a huge part of my work is, once again, lifting up places in the community and healers in the community that we don't necessarily lift up, right? Because maybe they don't have an apothecary like I do, or they don't have, they're not branded. And so then we believe that their work is lesser than until we're like actually really in need of some of the work that they do, right? Yeah. And then we're like, oh, maybe we believe now. But I digress. But, you know, I just see that where we've come to can be so exclusive because of our own privilege. So a huge part of it is looking, like you talked about class, it's like what privileges do we have also that we don't see healers in our community that are doing such heavy lifting. And I'm always grateful for those healers because I think of what my work would look like if I didn't have botanicas in places within the community that to provide so much spiritual work for people who are really needing it.
Yeah, like Jenny, I'm gonna intersect like patriarchy to racism and also yeah, classism. I often, like, if you do go to a botanica, you're gonna find things to do, whatever healing work you want to do, at a very affordable price, and that probably has a lot to do with why botanicas maybe are not staying around. So it's like maybe both gentrification, but also that folks are not willing to are not paying what that work is worth, and it hurts us. And what hurts even more to see is when we see in health and wellness, we see white people coming up and building these retreats in Costa Rica or wherever, and people paying, or apothecaries, and calling it, spiritual medicine and all this stuff. And it's like, well, where does this come from? Who are your people? And they cannot name that. And people are dropping thousands of dollars to go to these retreats, to go, they'll pay $20 for something that they will not pay at a botanica. And I think it's both, yes, this work needs to be accessible, needs to be affordable, and also we have to be putting money behind the people that whose knowledge is innate, whose knowledge is being passed down from our ancestors and from our countries of origin. Because if not, we're going to continue to disappear, and we're going to continue to not be named for our work. And white people are going to continue to make like these big ass companies and like selling you these natural organic products, and you're going to like pay for that because it's branded very nicely and packaged very nicely. But if my grandmother were to come through and be like, hey, here's this oregano tea, you're going to be like, can I have it for free? No, pay for that. That's not fair. And so all these things are intersected. Yes, it's like patriarchy, and even I think in health and wellness, we see a lot of women who have like adopted like this patriarchy, and we see a lot of white women that just like go and run with it, go with the yoga, go with the medicine, go with the you know, I'm a plant-based chef, so go with like the plant-based lifestyle, and are not naming where these foods are coming from when these herbs are coming from, where these plants are coming from, where this movement work is coming from. So like, let's not only like be naming it, but also let's be putting like our support and our finances behind that as well.
That resonates very closely because I operate MINKA Brooklyn, and so I see all the things that happens in the center. And you know, I see my clients who comes to take advantage of my generous sliding scale fee. And then I see the same client go and pay $200 an hour to work with a white practitioner. So then what does that mean, right? And I'm not saying that they mean it that way. They don't intentionally do it that way. But when somebody is offering sliding scale, it's because to be accessible for people who may not be able to pay $200 an hour. Not because I don't need money, I do. I live in New York City with 3 kids, yes, I do. So that really resonate with me, and I really think that's another key is, you know, sometimes the people ask, especially non-POC folks ask, how can I help POC people? How can I be anti-racist? One of the things that we don't talk about a lot is to put money behind POC business. If you feel that the business and the services that they offer is valuable, pay for them. Pay as much as you can do it. And I really strongly believe in that. So I want you to believe in that too. And another thing that I actually been really contemplating on is this idea of embodiment. With social media being very major way of doing marketing, and face-to-face marketing is very rare. And how do we uphold ourselves to embody our work? And this is ultimately what we are talking about in terms of social justice movement and healing intersect. Because when we talk to people, and when we talk with people that they might not actually agree with you, what they first see is, here is your words, but also how you show up. If you show up with anger, though your words are not angry, then they pick up on that. And they feel threat to that, right? So when we do this work, I'm not saying not to have anger. I know there's plenty of anger, frustration, and sadness. And at the same time, how do we transform that into a fuel that will carry us to be healthier and whole, and then carry this movement forward even further? So I want to ask you all about this particular question.
I'll go first.
Yeah.
So for me and the work that I do, it's all about intention, like showing up with the best intentions, knowing that the community comes first, but also understanding that in order for you to heal and do the work that you do in the community, you have to make sure that you're also right within yourself, and taking the time to heal is a major thing. And through movement and medicine and things like, there's tons of ways to do that, especially through food. You know, I mean, food can be a thing that triggers and also causes trauma, but if you encompass all of these things, then you can really begin to heal mind, body, and soul. It's not just one without the other, because then you're just running around in circles. And so for me, a lot of that also comes through political education and understanding how to discuss on a level and relate with folks that come to you for help, because you can't dictate to people how to move and what to do and what to take, but rather give them guidance in a way that suits their needs. And so that's kind of the approach that we take when we're first meeting people, or even when we have people that have been around for years around us trying to heal, and all they think about is their physical body. And so we have to remind folks that it's more than just the physical body that you have to take care of, because eventually that, over years, that changes. But if you start healing in a place from your mind, then there's ways that you can really, really have a lot of breakthroughs.
And I also want you to include how you do that, how you transform your anger, how you transform your sadness, how you transform that frustration.
Through good food, a lot
Through
of the
good
times.
food and a lot of, and I know,
and
and I want you to tell them about that thing you do with your daughter at home.
Well, yeah, we do a lot of dancing. Yeah, so that's a lot of one-on-one time, you know, helps me really when I do a lot of the healing. I always think about her and how she sees me move and how she sees me do things and how I show up and I'm present in front of people. And this is nerve-wracking for me, because it's the first time ever doing something like this, but you know, it's important, you know, because it's the only way we can find growth, is putting ourselves in positions that challenge us, but don't break you. And sometimes you have to break in order to bounce back, but you know, there's a fine line. But you know, we do little things like we cook together. You know, my household is all plant-based, and you know, I love all her recipes are really good. So we do a lot of experimentation at home, and I show her, you know, how, you know, it is to have a good relationship with food, and how that can be healing, and how that brings you joy, and how it brings people together in community through movement, practicing that, eating together, because we do a lot of potlucks at our space in Harlem, community potlucks where people bring dishes and share. It's not just about exercising. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, how can I get fit? And I'm like, yeah, but you know, what is your intention? Where are you coming from? Because I don't really like to set goals per se, but intentions to me mean a lot more. And so we try to foster that within the individuals to help them reach a place in their mind that they might not have even thought about.
Yeah, I'd agree that practices and consistency of practices is super important. And at the same time, I'll be honest, when I first started doing organizing work and activism work, I had a lot of anger and a lot of sadness. I remember my first major event that I did when I moved back to the U.S. was this big event calling out anti-Haitian, anti-Black sentiment within my own people, Dominican folks. And we were expecting a big amount of folks to come through, and they did. Like about 200 folks came through. They were like really needing the space. There's people in this room that were there too. We're like doing these workshops, and days prior to that event, we were getting threats from our own people, calling us Afrocentric, calling us if we love Haitians so much, we should move to Haiti. I had my own friends telling me like, why was I doing this to them? And that was super hurtful. And even though the event went great, we brought the collective I was working with, we call ourselves La Sala. We held that space beautifully. That night, I came down with a really bad migraine and like a lot of sadness. And while the space was beautiful, days prior to the event and days after, I wasn't taking care of myself. I wasn't holding practices that would have been able to sustain me pre, during, and post. And now, through that same collective, I'm gonna name Heidi Maria Lopez, who's an apprentice with Karen, and started the collective space I'm a part of, La Sala, learning about, like, we intentionally, okay, we're gonna have this big event. What are the practices we're holding before we're doing this? And like, how then is that gonna impact how we show up to that event or to that gathering? And that's the difficult part, because you're like running around doing all these other things, handling logistics, coordinating. So then setting time aside to write or to meditate or to eat well, to make your teas, like whatever it is, whatever practices it is that feel true to you, to heal yourself, the consistency is the challenging part. So there are practices that are super important to me, that do help me transform that anger, that sadness, that rage. I'd say definitely being in a practice of taking herbs, like damiana, ashwagandha, different things that I feel like help me with like my anxiety and my depression. And I'd say also writing and just praying to my ancestors, my spirits, and the higher powers I believe in, are practices that hold me and are not always the thing that I'm probably doing on a daily basis. But know that when I do fall sick, I can be like, but you weren't doing all those other things that usually make you feel really good. So again, like consistency of practices, I think is key to transforming or even just sitting with those feelings in a healthier way. So it's not like, you're never going to be angry, but if you are going to be with the anger, where's that coming from? Sitting with that and seeing what can manifest from those deep, real feelings.
Thank you, Karen.
Transforming anger. I was sitting here thinking about what that looked like, a conversation with my mothers and sisters, talking to Caribbean women about transforming their anger. But the biggest part of embodiment for me is to remember that I'm human, under all of this. I think people often come into the apothecary and I don't know what they expect, but they probably expected someone a bit more saintly than they see in me. Also, when I go out with people to eat, they're like, oh my God, that's what you eat? And I'm like, I'm Caribbean. Like, I can't wait to get home. Like, it's Christmas. We're gonna eat pepper pot here. But, for me, it's remembering that part of myself that's innately human. And I think that a lot of us have forgotten that because of academia, and because of like many places where we receive our activist training and our organizing training at, we're more concerned with like boundarying ourselves than really about opening our hearts up to people and actually showing up fully. And with my apprentices, I try to see how much I could be fully in front of them myself. So each day my challenge is to show up a bit more in my messy self. Like, even if I'm angry, like the anger is being held within the group, because it also gives people the opportunity for them to show up in themselves also when I can do that as their teacher. So this part about transformation, for me, it's looking back at, I get so much of my cues about who to be from how my grandmother existed. And I think about my grandmother as this amazing truth teller that was filled with love. And that you could go to my grandmother and tell her any kind of human story and she would still find understanding in it. And it was simple as, like, you were so sure about your relationship with her that there was a space for everything, and that she could also tell you that you're very wrong, and you need to change your way, but she didn't like close you out. And so my inspiration is that, really. So when I work with, like, how do I want to embody what it means to be a healer in this resistance work, I think about how to be more fully of like all these parts of myself that I feel like so many people are masked with it, with this place of like, well, no, I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna be very reflective about what I wanna hear from you because I'm hoping, and I'm like, oh, that's a 2-hour conversation that could have been 10 minutes, and then we could have really known how each other felt if we had the courage to like really speak up about it. And so it feels very not real, or moving with integrity in those spaces.
You know, I read at one time that masculinity, I'm not saying male, masculinity and femininity exist in all of us. Even if you're male, you have femininity. We all aware of that, right? Yes, we clear on that. So masculinity forces us or drives us to be perfect. Femininity drives us to be whole. And to be whole is to integrate all of our messy selves and to sit with our emotions and be okay with that because we are human. And I think, you know, as a movement, as human, collective of humans, who are we if we are not allowing each of us to feel what we feel? And say, it's okay that you're feeling that way. Don't blame yourself for feeling that way. It's fine, you're feeling it. So let's see how we can transform that into something we can do with, you know? And it takes time, and it takes courage. It's uncomfortable, because it's not just straight into the action. Because with masculinity, or with this patriarchal way of thinking, all right, we have a problem. We're gonna solve this. We have 40 days to do it. Let's plan, let's create a plan action, and let's get going. No, don't cry. You can do that at home. And why not hold that space? What's wrong with holding that space? Why do we think it's not part of the work? So that's kind of the question that I want to pose to all of you, and I believe we all want to pose to all of you to think about.